Welcome back. This is our last session before lunch. Lunch will be served in the Richmond room where you had breakfast this morning. For those of you that are attending the Incident Management Preparedness and Response Workshop powered by the Center of Excellence, you can proceed to the Grand York Ballroom at 12:30. And for those that are doing the Cyber 42 tabletop powered by SANS, you can go to the check-in desks at 11:35. Lunch will be served in the Cyber 42 room for you. And with that, I would like to bring our next presenter to the stage from Packetlabs, presenting on how the assumed breach principle can strengthen your security posture. Please welcome Ian Lynn.
Okay, my name is Ian. I today want to talk about assumed breach and how this principle can strengthen an organization's security posture. I think just a little bit about who I am first. I started my information security journey as a SOC analyst, quickly transitioned into penetration testing, and now we're doing a little mix of red team and purple team services, right? And just for security certifications, I have a few offensive security certifications under my belt, also a SANS certification. So I've been in this industry a little bit and doing some of the technical work. Right, and just also a little bit about Packetlabs. Packetlabs is a penetration testing firm. We're founded in 2011, and we're a team of pretty highly trained, proactive, ethical hackers that are, recruited to do work in organizations, applications, and different environments. We have experience in penetration testing across various industries, including finance, government, transportation, and healthcare. And I wanted to use our little agenda to cover what we're going to talk about today. Well, the first thing is one of the first problems with traditional penetration testing. What is the assumed breach principle and assumed breach in practice? And lastly, how does this principle improve an organization's security posture? And I think the main focus why I'm giving this talk is really because I'm speaking in front of security leaders who make the executive decisions to do testing for their clients. And I wanted to use this opportunity to sort of let you guys understand what goes into scoping out this work, what does this work look like, and different ways you can allocate your budget to have a better experience. I want to start off first with problems with traditional penetration testing. One of the first things you'll know is that traditionally there are three types. There's black box penetration testing, gray box penetration testing, white box penetration testing. Typically, for black box penetration testing, this is when you're given no knowledge of a network, no knowledge of an application, no diagram, no application flows, and you're just asked to do testing and see what you get out of it. This is my least favorite type of penetration testing because you don't get a lot of value. The reason is because penetration testers need to spend a certain amount of time to learn a certain environment, to learn a certain application. So when you're there to do black box penetration testing, you're not going to get the most bang for your buck. And then there's white box penetration testing. There's a higher barrier of entry. The certifications required to do white box penetration testing, and people who are from ex-developer backgrounds are best for this. Typically, this is when the diagrams are given, the network is well explained, the source code is given. And I think my favorite is probably gray box penetration testing. As Packetlabs, we do mostly gray box penetration testing. And I think there's more value in this type of penetration testing. I think assumed breach falls under the second category, and I'll explain a little bit further why. Okay, problems with black box penetration testing. Generally speaking, I think from the scoping side, the people who are soliciting penetration testing services, most people don't really understand how penetration testing engagements are carried out. So when they are soliciting these services, the intent's not very clear. So some people want penetration testing services for compliance reasons. They actually really just want a clean report, no issues found. They don't really want to improve their security. In this case, you want a black box penetration test because you don't want things to be found. In addition, I think it also because penetration testers need to spend time, they actually lose value because we take time in the engagement to learn a specific network or a system. It's also a time box activity. It means that this is really not your security posture like throughout the year. It's a point-in-time assessment, and it represents a state of security of a particular scope at a certain point in time. And I think thirdly, fourthly, there's a general confusion between a penetration test and a red team. And the next slide will cover this a little bit more. The pain point is really when people are asking for a red team, they really want a penetration test. And lastly, it's not really an accurate representation of real-world operators, and more on that a little bit later. So I'm going to get into a little bit of a soapbox for a second. Right? Red teaming and the red team, they are not the same. So if you're in a big organization, you might have a red team, right? And people come to me, oh yeah, you're the red team, right? I've been mostly a penetration tester for most of my life, not a red teamer. There's a big difference because the red team refers to a blanket statement of all offensive security work in the InfoSec space. Red teaming is all the other points below this, right? So for most organizations, they don't really need a true red teaming because of the large scope and how expensive it is versus the ROI on it. Third, they cannot be a red team without a blue team, right? The word team is in there. And what I mean by that is because, I've hit this roadblock plenty of times. I would be in an engagement with a client, and it would just be the IT manager and someone under them, and they have like an MDR or an MSP doing alerting on them. So when we're in a red team engagements, our job isn't to train the MSP or the SOC. It's actually to train the blue team, right? It's to improve your organization's blue team. So that's why when people sign up for a red team service and all they have is a SOC or an MSP, you don't want a red team because we don't improve your organization's blue team at all. And typically, red team is also interdisciplinary. So if you understand the red team kill chain, or if you look at something like the unified kill chain, you need experts in each one of these phases. You also need experts across industries. A lot of teams, a lot of firms don't have the resources to put this together. So when you're asking for a red team, you're paying for a load of experts. Also, a single person running an exercise is not red teaming. I know some large organizations do this. They hire a red teamer, and they expect one person to run the entire thing. You can't do that because you're supposed to measure the response of the blue team against the actions of the red team. If there's only one red teamer doing this, it won't. The attacks and the response won't match. And I think the largest part is scope and timing issues. A lot of times I'm on a red team engagement. They would say, oh, okay, we had this like 5 business units. Only fish the ones from, I'm going to give an arbitrary country. You can only fish the users in Mexico. Real world attackers aren't doing that. They're going after whoever they can get. And also an accurate emulation of TTPs used against the organization. So if your organization has threat analysts or IT people, InfoSec pros, you want to talk about what TTPs your organizations face. If you don't have that discussion, your first scoping call with us is going to be very, very awkward because we're going to need to talk about what types of scenarios we need to run. And I think lastly, if you didn't catch everything here, this is the biggest point, I think. A lot of the times people expect red teaming to be an initial access or a policy-focused exercise, when really red teaming is really supposed to be a SOC and an incident response exercise. It's really about detection, not really how we can get in. Okay. Now I want to go into what is the assumed breach principle. I want to show a few quotes from a few high-profile people in 2012. In 2012, Michael Hayden, the former director of NSA and CIA, said this: fundamentally, if somebody wants to get in, they're getting in. Number one, you're in the fight whether you thought you were or not. Number two, you almost are certainly penetrated. Second, from Robert Mueller, this is the former FBI director. There are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be. So this is, in 2012, there was an explosion of Stuxnet type of espionage incidents. And that gave leaders in this space to say, if an organization really wants to compromise your network, and get your crown jewels, they essentially will. So this principle, right, is really based on the assumption that the organization is already breached, right? So it's not really so much penetration testing anymore. It changes the focus from vulnerabilities to internal detection and response. And there's this concept of white carding. And if you don't know what white carding is, it's essentially behave as if you were penetrated. And the reason for white carding, and this is a big pain point for many security leaders, if we give you access, isn't that cheating for you? Not really, because the time required to achieve initial access is extremely expensive. We don't have months to spend, years to spend, developing an initial access vector into your organization. We don't have time to run supply chain scenarios that would likely get in, like with the whole Kaseya and SolarWinds breach. Right? So because the time required to achieve initial access is expensive, we're using white carding to get us access. Right. So this is why I want to talk about assumed breach in practice. I'm going to talk about two things here. Number one, social engineering. This is our adversary's favorite vectors of getting in. Number two, ways to carry out assumed breach. I have this diagram here. It sort of illustrates how we view phishing and social engineering engagements. In the yellow, this is the ones that are typically requested most by clients, but it doesn't yield the most value. On the right, in the purple, these are the things that are less frequently done, but are of more value. And because Packetlabs we're really an ambassador in the assumed breach red team execution model, we begin engagements where seeded access is used to simulate initial access. This typically allows us to focus on the areas that create the most value for our clients. We're simulating what happens after initial access. But despite this, I think a lot of clients still ask us to use social engineering or phishing to get in, right? And I think to understand why is because this is really the low-hanging fruit for adversaries. Exploiting a web application or an exposed VPN or firewall is rare, and social engineering is often the easiest way in. So I want to go through all five, and I sort of split this up on what you would expect out of this type of phishing. Right, so the first part I think is if you don't really understand how phishing engagements are carried out, this is the most requested one. And partially because there's no requirements. You don't need any setup. You just tell them go. Find whatever you can and go. Essentially what you're answering here is, can my organization get breached? And the unfortunate reality is, also from all the quotes of the three-letter agencies, is yes. So spending a lot of time here is not fruitful. Some of the metrics you're going to be expecting to get here is the response time and the time to detection, and measuring the impact of a successful phish. For example, if we phish a compromised user, how far can we go here? Right? And because there's no requirements, this is the most requested. But the value for this type of testing is very low. The cost is extremely high. The time it takes to carry this out is also extremely high. So next there's, I call this social engineering, but this is something most organizations, big organizations, enterprises do. Right? Essentially, you're trying to measure given your user base, what is the click rate or the emails open, the attachments open, links clicked, credentials entered, how many or who reported. So if you're an organization that does phishing exercises on a weekly, quarterly basis, this type of engagement is not something you really need, especially if you keep track of these metrics already. And what this really involves, it involves the whitelisting of domains, adversary domains and sender emails, whitelisting of benign executables. The value is still quite high. So if you don't have a good way of tracking this, we'll still do this for you. But the cost is relatively low, time is relatively short to do. The value is quite high, but it's not so high for you if your organization already practices this type of phishing. Right. Now, the other three types are more interesting. This is very less, not done as frequently, but I think it has probably the highest value. Number three is payload delivery, right? So in here, we're really trying to assess what message contents are allowed through your spam filters, what types of emails get in, right? And this includes executable and file types allowed in, whether or not you have external email tagging enabled, whether or not you're checking sender domain reputations. And typically, this is where we get in trouble because we're asking them for a corporate email account, maybe enabling a deactivated account and access to the email account. And the reason this is because we're trying to we don't really care about the metrics that we were talking about in the previous slide. We just want to know if someone has access to this email, what types of messages get in. The value is quite high. The cost is relatively, it's not the lowest, but it's in the medium range, and the time to do this is also not the highest either. The next one is probably the trickiest to do, payload detonation. This is really a mix of phishing and your endpoint testing. I think a big part of this is credential harvest. What happens when a credential harvest attack or payload detonation in your organization? We want to measure what the AV, antivirus or endpoint detection and response software's response to different payloads. We want to know what host-based controls prevent execution. Sometimes, you'll have a payload work. Have a payload not work, but you don't get any telemetry or logs or alerts on it, right? But it prevented execution. That's good to know, right? You also want to know if there's any opportunities to bypass MFA, and whether or not there's telemetry generated from these activities. And this is where we get into more trouble because we're asking them, hey, you need to whitelist our sender emails and domains. You need to give us a test email account and give us access to it. You need to give us a test workstation, AV, EDR software installed, and you have to click on all our test emails, or just give it to us, we'll click on it, and we'll simulate it for you. That discussion is very difficult, but you have to understand what we're measuring here, right? But the value of this is quite high, cost and time medium. Now, the last one is, I think, the most rare to do. This really is about measuring your response process, because assumed breach is really about detection and triaging, and responding to adversary actions. We care about the time to detect, the compromise, the time to respond to the compromise, the time to fully eradicate the compromise. I have two stories for you that I'll share shortly, and I'll tell you how long we have access to, on average, to a certain organization. Typically what we need here is valid credentials and the MFA enrollment process, and we need a witting victim, meaning we need someone outside of the IT team to click on the payloads, and we will see the SOC or the blue team how they triage the alert. Did this action trigger an alert? Did the analyst triage this alert properly? And were the actions done by the adversary match the response by the organization? And did the response actually stop or hinder the attackers? Right. So just as an example, this is one of my favorite attacks. I think we've all known about this because it's been used by the Lapsus group to compromise Microsoft and Okta. It's generally when you gain access to a credential of a company, and the attacker spams the prompt, right? You might think this is not very intelligent action, but it really works. Just a few days ago, we got into an organization like this again, right? Essentially, the user eventually accepts because you got to imagine timing. If I did this to you at 3 a.m., I did it 12 times. You're sleeping. You want to not, unless you put it on disturb, you generally will click yes. Most people will. And after that, we're typically in that email inbox account, and we'll probably follow up with another layer of social engineering to gain access to the network. And this has been proven successful by the group Lapsus. One thing I forgot to mention. When we do this, this is an example of the response process. If we do this, can your organization see this attempt? I have only seen one organization that's been able to detect this properly. And so, this is something for, IT practitioners to try as well. Can your organization do this detect a compromised account? And I think here's where I want to run into some stories. And there is this client that we have. They're friendly people, but they have some concepts that need adjusting. So obviously, they signed up to do the initial access. I want you to phish. I don't believe we can be phished successfully with all the controls we have in place with our world-class SOC blue team, right? They do have a very great blue team, by the way. So they want us to answer the questions: can we be phished, and what's the impact of this phish? And essentially, when we're phishing them, our emails don't generally land in an organization with a strong spam filter. And so we had to sort of go about this in a roundabout way to get us access, right? So first off, if you understand how spam filters work, if you have a history emailing someone outside the domain of your organization, that becomes trusted according to the spam filter. So what we did here, in order to get to that position, was to fabricate an email, pretending we're from a real HR coordinator, using HTML editing. So what you see here, we simply went into Gmail, right-click, inspect element, changed all the HTML stuff, the names, the picture, everything here, right? And we took a picture of this. And then we attached that picture into an email, right? And we sent this email to a target user using this fake screenshot. Right, to say, and this was the pretext. You have to understand, a lot of people on LinkedIn, they post where they work at, but they also post their personal information, where to reach them via mobile, and their personal email address if they have their resume there. Now, I want you guys to think about this. If I were to phish this user towards their personal email address, how does your detections fare? It usually doesn't. You don't have any insight to what their personal email addresses are. So we use this to say, the text is really small here. Can you please try checking your email? We tried contacting you via your corporate email, but it didn't work. So this person actually responded to us to this phish. When we sent her sent it to her personal email, they responded back with their corporate email address, right? And at this point, our domains, our sender domains, were trusted. This took 2 weeks to accomplish, right? And in this sort of engagement, where typically the shortest time is 4 weeks, this took up half the time. Do you really want to spend 2 weeks to get here? I mean, we can, but you're paying for this, and you're really just answering the question: can we be phished? Usually, yes. I think to just wrap up this story, what we typically ended up doing was we sent spear phishing emails to ask users to check their benefits package change. This was the same pretext, and we had the same user input credentials into the benefits form, and we just called them up. Hey, because sometimes they put their help desk phone number up. We spoof that number and say, we're from help desk. We are this person. Can you please just accept all the notifications for 24 hours? And this is another way to get in. Okay, ways to simulate assumed breach scenario. So I'm going to wrap up, after sort of going through a similar process, I'm going to wrap up with another story too. There's 4 typical ways people are doing this across different firms. Traditional, malicious user, compromised user, and continuous adversarial simulations. Traditional. This is the most done, but it's actually very inaccurate, and I'll explain why. The ease of access and setup is very minimal. You tell them, hey, install Kali Linux onto ESXi or whatever virtualization. Here, we'll ship you a Pi. We can get started for testing. I guess the pros for this is you can really test LAN-based abuses. For example, relaying, poisoning, adversary in the middle type attacks. But you have to understand, if this exercise is all about detection, it's not a good representation of real-world operators. Because when a user gets compromised, they land on a Windows machine. They're using your company workstation image. So when you're using an internal Kali VM to do this type of testing, it's not a true representation. And when you're trying to build and craft detections, you're not going to get a good result, right? So the value for this, I'm not saying there's no value in this. Of course there is, but it's not as valuable as having an exact replica of the entire setup. This is where we get into the malicious user type, right? Typically, what we do here is a client will ship a laptop to us with exactly the installed user. We're trying to emulate insider threat scenarios, right? And so that's why we use a representative workstation of an employee. And this will paint a more accurate picture of a malicious insider threat. Someone that we bought off, or someone that an adversary bought off, someone that had leverage over a certain employee. And because actions performed by this image or this computer, they leave a detectable footprint that mirrors reality. The time of setup here is quite high on the client, and there's really different opinions on and philosophies on white carding. And the cost is generally higher because it involves multiple vectors. But the value from this is quite high. You'll typically be able to craft very accurate detections. And next is the compromised user. So this simulates an employee who clicks on a payload. So as for us, as the adversary, as the attackers, we're operating over a specific C2 framework or multiple C2 frameworks sometimes. This is also an accurate representation of a malicious insider threat, but it's one of a compromised user. So a payload that bypasses your products, what would that look like? What would these attacks look like? This is a good middle ground in terms of setup because all you need to do is whitelist that binary if we can't bypass your detections in time. This is also where the difficulty is because clients don't really, so if real world attackers can get us with the payload, you should be able to bypass our products. Yes, we can, given time, right? Value of this is quite high if you go the white carding approach. Otherwise, we're going to be spending most of the time on phishing you and developing that payload which may or may not work. Lastly, this is probably the most expensive because all three are point-in-time assessments. So for some bigger clients, we do this continuously over a span of a few weeks and months. We can simulate more sophisticated, advanced persistent threat actors. And we can even emulate supply chain threat scenarios. And this really will solidify a security team's hunt methodology because we're going to be spending months in their network. They're going to be spending their time trying to figure out where we are, what we are doing, and continually trying to stop us. And because continuous testing leads to continuous training for security teams, this yields the highest value. But the problem here is the high amount of collaboration and coordination is needed. Say you have 5 people on your security team. A good chunk of them will need to be on this for the time of the engagement. And that's something perhaps not very practical, especially if they need to handle current and tasks and incidents. This is probably the highest cost. Most organizations do not need this. Okay, now we're going to run through another story. Now, this is another organization where we're requested to do social engineering into their network, but they've given us the option. Once you hit a certain time, where they're going to white card us. They're going to give us seeded access. So this organization is very interesting. They have a lot of telemetry, and they have a lot of controls built in. So a normal compromised user can't get anywhere. So, for example, the reason I think we couldn't get our emails to land in an inbox, and we couldn't get our emails whitelist or trusted in time. So what we did was we went through LinkedIn and wherever other social media and things like Zoom info, and same vector, we looked for their personal accounts. This time we used their personal numbers, and we sent a targeted campaign via SMS for credential capture. We copied to perfection their VPN portal, and we sent them a pretext, hey, your VPN session has expired and your access is now limited. Please sign in over here to refresh your VPN session. And I think we only got one user, I believe, right? But when we got this user, we're presented with a unique problem. This is that second prompt there. That's Azure conditional access. And for those of you who don't know what that is, essentially this is an access policy based on certain parameters. For example, if you're not logging in from the IP we're expecting you to log in from, no go. If you're not using the specific browser we want you to do, no go. If your host isn't the host we're expecting, can't log in. So it's very interesting. But during our scoping call, I think our VP, he decided to include physical access as part of the threat model, because they've never thought about it before. They've done a very good job at securing their remote access. So what we did, we didn't try this credential everywhere. We held on to it. We had this account for 22 days from when we fished that person towards the end of the engagement. So we sent two of our staff members into their office, and on the first day when they scoped out this office, we realized that there was a floor where it was meant for external contractors and for people to bring clients in. So there's no checks about who they're bringing in. So we decided, hey, what if we just walked in there and see what we can do? Because physical was part of it. So we had two people walk in, and you could physically sign up for a boardroom. It's sort of like those open workspaces. And they went in, they took the smallest boardroom, they ripped out one of the Ethernet jacks, and they're like, I don't think this will work. They probably had NAC, network access control. So plugged it in. Oh, so there's an IP. It assigns an IP, but you're not really trusted. And they use something called 802.1x. Essentially, you need a corporate credential to get onto the trusted part of the network. And that's what we did. We took that account and we logged into the network. And that really was how we got in for this specific example. And in this office, there were also workstations for people to use, and they're open workstations. And what was interesting is, you can't use these workstations unless you have an account. So we walked into the office and we used the open workstations, and we put a sticker on the computer so no one would would turn this off. And we ripped off the HDMI and VGA cord, and we plastered that sticker there saying, organization, IT team here, please do not remove. And we just had access to this workstation for the entire engagement. And so this was the beachhead for us to do a variety of things, right? So this is part of the exercise. It's really about them trying to find out where we are. We installed persistence on this host. This became the beachhead for the entirety of the engagement. And the more time, essentially, you allot for the assume breach part of the assessment, the more value your blue team gets when trying to respond to these attacks. So, needless to say, from that beach host, we're eventually able to pivot to multiple servers, including the domain controllers. From where one of the objectives we were tasked to do was to compromise their backup infrastructure and to also access their production AWS Azure tenants as well. This entire thing took 2 days, and we had 22 days of access. Right? So that's the speed at which attackers are gaining access. So that's why it's very important in your assumed breach to know whether or not your blue team can respond to these threats in a very timely manner. And typically, the more time you allot to the assumed breach part of the engagement, the more value your blue team will get when training them to respond to the attack. Okay, I want to spend the last few minutes explaining how this strengthens your security posture. I think the biggest part that I want everyone to take away was you have to know and understand that a compromise in an organization is actually an eventuality. They will get in if they're motivated enough to. And by diverting time and money as to the part of the assessment that yields the most benefit to your blue team, that's a wise strategy. Sometimes people take our penetration test report and they go up to their C-levels and they say, look at all these issues. We need more money. We need more of a security budget to secure our infrastructure, our organization. And what do they do with that money? They go out to buy the next generation EDR, next generation products, right? We've been outclassed before, but not by a particular singular product or technology. It's usually by a mix of two things: security strategy and the people. So people who outclass us, they're usually a team of just as knowledgeable security experts on the blue team. It's not a product that you're supposed to go after. It's about investment to your blue team. And number three, I think having a productive white-collar conversation is key. I think as security leaders, if you understand that assumed breach is an eventuality, then I think you'll try to put your intent and money on the exercise that produces the most value to your blue team. So a lot of times when we misscope the assumed breach assessments, time and money is wasted on misunderstood and commonly misunderstood exercise and a very limited scope. And I think there are some Microsoft people here that have given talks about zero trust architecture. If you read, if you ever consult Microsoft documentation on how to build a zero trust architecture, you'll find these three guiding principles. This is from Microsoft, right? Verify explicitly, never trust, always verify. So, I think this is a commonly talked about concept. The use of least privilege in terms of access. I remember there was a speaker, if there was a CEO that's requesting for access, do you give them access? I think one of the first questions you have to ask is why, right? And third, assume breach. So this is actually a mindset. So if you truly understand this principle of assume breach, you'll probably operate and also conduct an engagement in this manner. And I think the last point I want to mention in terms of maturity, it's not a technology or singular product that can help you build zero trust architecture. It's actually more of a security strategy. And you have to understand, it's not an overnight thing. If you want to implement zero trust for your organization, improvement comes in maturity phases. This is not something you can change overnight. And you really have to evaluate your security strategy when you want to implement this kind of model for your organization. I think that's all I have for my talk. I have a few frequently asked questions, but now I want to open up to the audience of, if you guys have any questions for me in terms of the assumed breach principle. Okay, I think the last 3 minutes, I'll cover this. Right, real attackers don't need to be given access. Isn't giving access to penetration testers cheating? I think we covered this. It's not cheating because time, I think, is the biggest hindrance and the biggest obstacle in this type of testing. So really, you're saving time and money by giving penetration testers seeded access to do this. The second one is a little more controversial. In a malicious user emulation scenario, for that workstation, should AV and EDR be disabled when we hand over your golden workstation image? That's a little tricky, and we need to have a conversation about this. Typically, how we would run this is we'll spend some time trying to disable or bypass that product. And after that time is up, you whitelist us or you disable that on that workstation. And lastly, can assume breach simulation miss things? Yes, because you have to understand assume breach, the red team execution model. It's not a penetration test where we throw exploits or we start scanning things. We don't run VA scans in this type of simulation because we're trying to operate how an operator would act. So if an operator is not going to come into your network, install Qualys, install Nessus, and scan your network, that's just not going to happen. They're going to use the software that's already there to try to compromise your systems, try to see if they can leave with any of your crown jewel data. Yeah, so I think these are some of the common questions, and I hope this session has been helpful for people that are making executive decisions to solicit these services. And I really hope when you do this properly, you see the value you get back from it. I think that's okay. It's not working. I think that's all. Please come visit us. I think we're at booth A3. If you have any questions about any of the things we talked about today, come visit us here. We'll try to give you some answers on these questions. And if you're interested on the exact pricing, please speak to anyone with a Packetlabs jacket. They'll be able to give a more precise answer than I can. And really, thank you for allowing me to speak on this stage to inform security leaders that that have been it been more years in the industry than